So welcome to Learning Point with DK, and today I will continue the chapter 1 from Footprints Without Feet, and the name of the chapter is A Triump of Surgery, and this is written by James Harriet. Here we have three main characters. Let's see here: Tweaky, Mrs. Humphrey, and Mr. Harriet. Tweaky, who is the central character of this chapter, and the whole story revolved around him. Tweaky, who is the dog and a very close and near and dear to the owner or the mistress, Mrs. Humphrey. Mrs. Humphrey, who is the mistress of this dog, and she fed him a lot. And due to feeding him a lot, Tweaky became very fat or hugely fat and was not able to move. Mr. Harriet came and saw him like a blotted, you see the blotted sausage. Blotted sausage are kind of like a meat which is actually placed inside a stick of iron and then got placed on a oven. That is, in Hindi we say kebab. Sausage means you can say ink is not kebab. Like this is what you can say about it. Like that he was. And then Tweaky's condition was not good. So Mr. Harriet suggested Mrs. Humphrey not to overfeed him. She did not take it seriously and kept feeding him like the things you can see here: cod liver oil. What is cod liver oil? This is a kind of oil which is taken out from the liver of a fish, and this is called cod liver oil. So it's very fatty. Another one is a malt. It's a kind of coarse or thick grain, like we say barley joe, that type of. Then a bowl of Horlicks. So these are the items even Mr. Harriet asked her not to give to Tweaky, though she used to give it. And due to this, the weight of Tweaky putting on day by day. Then see what happened after that. Mr. Harriet came and he saw the condition this time worsened. He once again suggested you need to do two things. First of all, he asked, have you cut his diet? Then she said she tried to cut, but she could not stop herself because Tweaky loved to eat sweet things. As you asked me not to feed him, so he did not want to eat. So I had to, or I could not stop myself, and then gave him his favorite food, that is sweet cakes, that is made of sugar, and chocolates. Apart from that, when Mr. Harriet asked her, have you given him some exercises? So she said, oh, my maid, he was not okay, he was suffering from lumbago. You see that? Lumbago. What is this? A kind of muscular pain below the waist or below the back. And due to that, he was not able to walk in the morning time. That's why Tweaky was also not taken for morning walk. And so he did not have the exercises as well. Due to all these things, the condition of Tweaky was now worsened. This time Mr. Harriet said two things. First, to cut the diet of Tweaky. Second, gave him extra exercises every day. You see what he said? He said to cut his Tricky's diet, and second, give him more exercises. But you see, this was not happened. Mrs. Pumphrey put her head down like this and moving in the street. It was like she was definitely making her mind understand what Mr. Harriot was saying. She must follow those instructions. However, she could not follow. And so, what are the consequences? Finally, Mr. Harriot was called very soon. When he arrived, he saw the condition of Tricky was very, very much pathetic. At that time, Mr. Harriot told Mrs. Pumphrey, you had to take him to the hospital. So, Mrs. Pumphrey did not want to let him to go to the hospital because she thought that without seeing her, it means the dog Tricky, if he would not see Mrs. Pumphrey even for a day, he could not live in the hospital. She was that much attached to the dog Tricky. Ultimately, having seen no alternatives or options, she allowed Mr. Harriot to take him to the hospital. When the dog was to taken to the hospital, the condition was that the servants of the house, they moved there and started bringing the different items belong to the dog. What happened there? Like the ring by which he used to play, then dinner bowl, noon bowl, supper bowl, toys, cushions, etc. items they brought there. Some coats also. Even Mrs. Pumphrey herself brought the coat and threw towards the doctor, Mr. Harriot. Mr. Harriot, he understood that these things could not be fitted in the car, so he moved the car. He took Tricky in the hospital, and as soon as Tricky was in the hospital, a group of dogs and the leader of the dogs, that was Joe. You see here Joe, J-O-E, Joe, he also arrived. All the dogs moved around him and found him like an uninteresting object, as Tricky had no movement, was like a motionless thing. So this is why they moved away from there. You see what happened after that? See what was the protocol of treatment, how Mr. Harriot actually treated him. He had not given any type of medicines. He left him hungry for 2 days only on water. It means only water was given to him, no food at all. But what happened after that? That was result very positive. According to Mr. Harriot, it was only the way to treat him. And the third day, he started moving and wanted to play with the rest of the dogs. Now he started playing, fighting with them at the night time, hunting the rats with them in the hen house, in the daytime, fighting with them for their food which was placed in the bowl. Actually, the first time when Tristan, you see, Tristan is the person. He is the person who placed the food in the bowl the first day. And Tricky was not able to compete with the dogs. And he had to lick 2 bowls to feed his belly. So at that time, Mr. Harriot saw these things, and next day he arranged an extra bowl for Tricky. Now Tricky got recovered, and he was getting recovered very fast. And so he was very hopeful. Very soon Tricky was completely recovered. At that time when Tricky was in the hospital, Mrs. Pumphrey used to call a dozen of calls. And Tricky was, playing with the dogs, fighting with them, fighting and competing for the food and all these things, and getting better, losing his weight and getting more and better condition and muscular. On the other hand, Mrs. Pumphrey was very much worried about Tricky. Used to call again and again Mr. Harriot. Mr. Harriot told her that his condition is getting better. That's why Mrs. Pumphrey wanted to know his health condition. So, health bulletin, you can say, that is the latest health bulletin of the dog that was told to her by Mr. Harriot. Now, due to this news, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending, first of all, 2 dozen of eggs, which they enjoyed in the breakfast time, I mean to say Mr. Harriot and his companions. Second, wine, which they used to enjoy in the noon time with the food, that is the noon food or noon meal. And the third one that was sent is brandy. So many brandy bottles were also sent. So you see that eggs, 2 dozen eggs, wine, and then brandy. These items were sent for Tricky to make him better and stronger as soon as it was possible. And now Mr. Harriot could understand the desperate condition of Mrs. Pumphrey to make or to see Tricky very healthy. So he enjoyed all these items, Mr. Harriot, because he could use these things like in the breakfast time, eating eggs, in the noon time, drinking with the food, wine, and the night time enjoying a brandy in front of the fire, because that time was cold time. Okay, fine. Harriet was enjoying all these things, but how long? Now he wanted to make Tricky as a permanent guest of his hospital. But he could not continue like this, as his inner conscience, his own soul, asked him and compelled him to make the call to Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey was called, she came, and as soon as Tricky saw Mrs. Pumphrey, he jumped and just landed in the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey. And this is how Mrs. Pumphrey and the love in between Tricky and Pumphrey could be seen here. When Mrs. Pumphrey was taking Tricky, she was very much emotional, saying, "How can I ever thank you?" She said these words to Mr. Harriot. And finally she said, "This is a triumph of surgery." Triumph means victory. Triumph means, that means victory, and surgery means here hospital. So she said, "This is the victory."